Hello, and welcome to a video highlighting important pre- and post-installation features of the iSTAR Ultra SE controller. In the first video of this series, we covered dip switch configuration on the General Control Module, or GCM board, and the importance in setting the correct mode you want the controller to operate in. In the second video, we highlighted correct SD card installation and Ethernet port selection and configuration. In the third video of this series, we're going to highlight an issue regarding firmware updates that utilize the iSTAR configuration utility, or ICU. Let's go ahead and get started. When performing firmware updates on an iSTAR Ultra controller, the ICU must be nested in the proper Windows folder structure to correctly download and install firmware for the controller. In the past, when performing firmware updates on legacy controllers, it was not important that the ICU executable be accessed and opened from a specific location. But now it is critical that firmware updates are performed in a specific way, and the benefit is that this new process dramatically speeds up the firmware download and installation process. Used in conjunction with the open source web server Lite TPD, the ICU executable, when launched, now also launches the Lite TPD executable. The Lite TPD program speeds up web traffic in speed-critical environments and helps in speeding up the firmware download process. Working in conjunction to facilitate the update, if the ICU executable, the Lite TPD folder, and the firmware folder are not located in the proper structure together, the ICU and Lite TPD executable will not simultaneously open and the proper firmware folder contents will not be accessed. Not creating and utilizing this exact folder structure will cause the firmware update to fail. If you have experienced firmware update errors on an Ultra controller, the following information will help in correcting that problem. As mentioned, the ICU executable file, the Lite TPD folder, and the firmware folder must reside in the same folder structure as shown here to successfully perform a firmware update. This structure is initially created upon installing the Crossfire software. The Crossfire framework services manage communication between the clients and the SQL database, and between the database and the server components or drivers. These files can be moved anywhere a user desires, but the ICU.exe, the Lite TPD, and the firmware folder structure relationship must remain the same. In the following screen, note that the ICU executable file has been moved to the desktop with the idea it will most likely be located and accessed much faster when a firmware update is required. This orientation will not work in performing an update, as again, the ICU.exe, the Lite TPD, and the firmware folder all need to be located in the same folder structure when performing a firmware update. In this situation, the ICU.exe file needs to be moved back into the folder structure with the Lite TPD and firmware folders. In the next screen, a shortcut that points back to the ICU.exe file has been placed on the desktop. Now this will work in performing a firmware update as long as the shortcut always points back to the ICU.exe file, and that exe file is resident in the same folder as the Lite TPD and firmware folders. If the folder containing those files is relocated, then a new shortcut will need to be created pointing to the change path. Regarding the ICU, once it has been opened, if you change any settings in the Options pop-up window, you need to close out of the ICU and restart it as an administrator. Also, ensure the server root directory input box shows that the path to the Lite TPD folder is as follows, and that the server HTTP port is set to 9701. If you have further technical issues completing a firmware update, one check that can be done to ensure your ICU and Lite TPD executables are in the proper folder structure is to open your Windows Task Manager and locate the ICU.exe and Lite TPD.exe images. Once the Windows Task Manager has been opened and displayed on the screen, locate the ICU.exe image, do a right mouse click, and then select Properties. This launches a Properties window whereby you can check the location path of the executable. Next, locate the Lite TPD image and perform the same check and confirm that their location paths are the same as in the example shown. If not, correct the issue and attempt the firmware update once again. Another important tip to follow when performing firmware updates on an Ultra or Ultra SE controller is as follows. When performing the update and utilizing the ICU, the update should be completed on a different computer than the ICU resident on the Secure 9000 administration station. Both the ICU and Secure 9000 need to utilize light TPD to perform a firmware download. They will interfere with each other's download settings, resulting in a failure when used on the same computer. And a last but important tip when opening the ICU, perform a right mouse click on the executable and run it as an administrator. That will ensure all the proper permission levels are met and that the download will be successful. Alright, that concludes this video highlighting issues regarding firmware updates for the iSTAR Ultra SE controller that utilize the iSTAR configuration utility.